All right. I am speaking with Dallas HARTWIG. Thank you for coming on today, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
The genesis of this is that you posted something on Instagram that was so thoughtful and well articulated that I just reposted it. And then I started getting all this feedback from people saying, Chris, you've never written so well. You've never expressed yourself so clearly. And I'm like, bitch, that wasn't me. Don't compliment me now. So anyway, congratulations. Somehow you made me look good and bad at the same time there. So
well, I was very complimented by the fact that you reposted it. So we're all winning here.
Right. And then I said something like in the repost, I said, I'm aware of the irony. And it was because you were part of your post was about like, have your own ideas. Don't just, mimic other people's thoughts, think things through for yourself. And I was like, yeah, I'm aware of the irony of me reposting someone saying thing for yourself. And then, but you reached out and you're like, hey, thanks for reposting, but what was the irony? Just
totally.
To clear
well, you never
up.
quite know what people mean,
Well, yeah. Well, what did you think? Did you think I was like trying to take the piss out of you somehow, or
no, not at all. I try. I mean, over the years, I've kind of changed my thinking, but I certainly try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and like I assume that like they're not being assholes, and so I was not assuming that at all. I just wasn't sure if there was some subtlety in some subtle thread through your writing that I had missed along the way.
No subtlety, nothing. Yeah, well, that's kind of your thing, right? I mean, I don't think I followed you before that. I think someone must have forwarded that to me or something, and then I started following you and on Instagram, and I was struck by the beauty of the photography. I mean, you take some awesome photos. But also you put a lot of thought into your posts, and it kind of seems like your Instagram feed is I don't know, like you intend it to be educational, and a lot of what you're doing is trying to move people away from the vitriol and victimization and more into generosity and kindness end of the spectrum, which is certainly something needed. Is that an accurate representation of what you're doing?
I think it totally is. I think that growing up in a Christian home, I think that whole idea of like be a good person is like deeply embedded in my psyche, and I think that still spills out even though the religiosity has been leaked out for a long time. But I have an 8-year-old son, and prior to having my boy, whether it made the world better or not wasn't particularly important to me. I paid lip service to it, but now like it's way more than lip service, because I'm like, oh, he has to live in the world that I'm contributing to. Right. So there's a much deeper motivation for contribution of something meaningful, something, that lasts, something that is unifying, something that is healing, because he has to live in that world. And it breaks my heart to watch the world change as it has in the course of my lifetime, because it hasn't gotten markedly better.
Yeah, that's putting it generously.
Well, right. I mean, this is something that you and I both, I was chuckling about this because you and I both disagree with Steven Pinker's assessments of the world. And, I didn't get very controversial in my last book, but I did specifically name him in some of my disagreements with his perspective, which of course you did in your last book as well. So yeah, I don't have the sensation that the world is getting brighter and shinier. And that is sort of the double reason to contribute something, whatever that is that I can.
Yeah. Did you think about this stuff before having a child? Was this part of the run up to it, or is this kind of your shifting global perspective, an unexpected response to having had a child?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, I think, my kind of previous career, I practiced physical therapy, and so there's sort of a healing element to that as well. So that's always kind of been present in the background, like, sort of making the world around me, whether it's my immediate physical vicinity or something larger, better has always been part of it. And then with 2 marriages, both of which ended in divorce. And then having my boy, I was like, oh, I should maybe take a closer look at the way I'm showing up, because seemingly actually not everything is everyone else's fault. So then it was, I think having failed relationships, and I don't mean failed in the fact that they ended, I mean failed in the fact that they went badly, kind of as an unavoidable mirror to your own stuff. And you can look away from it for a while, but sooner or later you're like, oh, the same thing keeps happening. Maybe it's me.
Right.
And then having my boy, I was like, oh, not only is it me, definitively yes, but also I really, 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 really want to make the world better, because I want him to have a different life experience than I had.
Yeah. What is it that you found in yourself? What was the recurring pattern that jumped out at you?
Profound selfishness, and inability to see what was actually happening for me in relation to other people. Certainly, and downstream from that, blaming everyone for all of the problems other than myself. And I think also just having a real small-mindedness and a really kind of immature adolescent masculine specifically perspective, and doing really well in the world in the hierarchical, dominating, competitive, virtue signaling, posturing sense. But missing this whole other range of human experience that I wanted my boy to have, that I didn't have in my younger years. Right.
But you didn't miss it when you didn't have it?
I didn't know it was a thing. I'd never seen it. I didn't. My dad didn't demonstrate it. I didn't have other kind of older men around me showing that way of being. So I didn't know that there was that way of existing. And the place between, let's say, 10 or 15 years ago and now has been fraught with banging my head into very hard objects that were immovable, and then realizing, oh, gotcha. Okay. It's not been like a glorious, smooth, graceful, painless transition for sure.
Right. So you've got two books?
I've got 3 books. I co-authored my first 2 with my ex-wife. Those were on nutrition, and then published my 3rd on my own last year. Coincidentally, literally the day that the WHO was like, hey, people, we have a pandemic. It wasn't ideal timing for sure. Right.
Yeah. My last book came out, I think, 4 months before. And, every time I'm talking to my agent about it, he's like, well, it did pretty good given the fact that COVID hit, It's like, oh, yeah, given the fact.
Right. The qualifier.
Yeah, it changed everything. So, you talked about something that you were missing and that your father didn't model for you, and you didn't have other older men around, and your own transition from more of a selfishness and a sort of adolescent sense of masculinity toward something different now. So what is masculinity? Is this a big part of the transition? Do you feel like you're trying to model in your attention to kindness and gentleness and all the stuff that we mentioned earlier in your public utterances? Is this what you're doing? Are you speaking to young men trying to say, hey, there's a different way to do this? You don't need to bang your head up against these walls that I've been...
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that for me, becoming a healthier, more grounded, more integrated man slowly over time means that I do show up differently than I used to, no doubt. I think there's also a piece where I don't feel either qualified or even capable of speaking to and inspiring the kind of teenage or early 20-something men. And I think back to when I was that age, and I actually wasn't looking to 30 or 40 or 50 or 60-year-old men for guidance because I thought I already knew everything, right? Like I was like, oh, you're old and washed up. Like that's sort of the youthful, perspective.
Right.
And so I think I could intend to speak to and write for those young men, but we're really dumb when we're that age. And,
do you think that's just baked into the cake? That's just testosterone poisoning?
I think it is uninitiated masculinity. I think it is that sort of an adolescent bit. So I think that's one of the beautiful things that happens in many primitive cultures is there is a pretty forceful reorientation from that self-interested, hierarchical, dominating, competitive, immature, and even narcissistic way of being for the young boys and men that really does get like forcefully turned in the direction and sort of reoriented to something outside of themselves, right? So there's a reorientation to the betterment of the collective, of the tribe. But that doesn't happen spontaneously. That has to be done to them. It has to come from the outside. That didn't happen for me. So it took a couple extra decades to incrementally chip away at the things that I wish would have happened when I was 14 or 16.
Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like I agree with you that it's very. There's an old Navajo expression that I love. You can't awaken someone who's pretending to be asleep. And I feel like there are definitely people, young men, who are just unreachable in many ways. But I also feel that there is a huge audience of young men. Audience might be the wrong word. Cohort, yeah, of young men who are very self-aware and seeking some sort of guidance or older men that they can respect and admire and that seem accessible in some way, and I think we see that in the Jordan Petersons and the Joe Rogans, and like there's this sort of pantheon of dudes that other young guys are sort of looking up to.
Yeah, I think that's true.
It's dangerous.
I think many of us have awoken in a dark wood.
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. And, I wanted to talk with you about that because I feel like, with social media and, the age, I don't know how old you are, but I'm about to
43.
turn 60. Right. So we're both old enough to know better, supposedly. It's a weird thing because there's an impulse to offer some sort of comfort or guidance or the benefit of one's own experience. But as you were saying, there's also, if you're a healthy person, you're also constantly thinking, I'm not qualified to tell anyone else how to live, right? There's there's a self-defeating mechanism somehow where like anyone who actually is worth listening to will immediately say, don't listen to me, I have no idea what I'm talking about. It's like the Buddha said, don't follow me, I'm just a guy, oh, that's why you're so interesting. It's a strange thing. How do you manage that? How do you manage being in the public eye and having these people? And you are saying things on your Instagram account that are, it's offering a sort of wisdom. You're saying this, I woke up this morning and had this thought, and there's something very universal about the things that you're sharing. Yeah.
I don't know if I necessarily even know how to answer that. Phrase that differently for me. Ask the question differently.
How do you deal with the conundrum of offering insights on social media to strangers without falling into the ego traps of being a self-proclaimed guru or leader?
Totally. I mean, I think there's the imposter syndrome part of it, which you referenced a second ago. There's the I don't know all the answers, so therefore don't listen to me. But I think there's also just a part that's genuine humility in there. And I think of humility so much as just the intellectually honest recognition of one's weaknesses. And so I don't have to have insecurity and imposter syndrome to still say very clearly and very truthfully, like, I don't know what I'm doing in so many spaces in my life. I think also even in like thinking about writing, whether it's something small like an Instagram post or like a larger book project, I just been like, I follow the axiom of like, write the thing that I want to read or that I wish I could have read in some point in the past. And so I'm, in the early stages of working on another book with a co-author, a dear friend of mine, Rainier Wild. And we are writing the book that we wish we had 10 or 15 or 20 years ago and just didn't exist. So there's that piece that's kind of in the background for me too, of like, write for me at some point in the past, or write for me in the present. I mean, so much of the stuff now is fairly real-time observations and thoughts and realizations that are sometimes small and sometimes big. But I don't think about writing for the audience. I don't think about what do they need to hear, what do they need. I'm like, what's happening in my life, and then I'll share something that feels meaningful. So that the actual what the audience needs or what I project upon them is not really part of that equation. Right.
That it comes across that way, as if you are sharing insights as they occur to you. Not like you're sitting
literally
on a
what's
mountain.
happening. No, totally.
Yeah.
I mean, many times, I mean, my Instagram is not scheduled. It's not daily. It's not playing the game and posting at certain times a day with a certain keywords. Like, it's just literally things happen to me and I think about them. And then if I have time, I write about them and then they go. It's a really bad strategy it's a really bad business strategy, but it feels really authentic for me.
Yeah. It feels to me like vulnerability and authenticity are two sort of guiding stars for you at this point in your life. Were those things that were you like covering that stuff up before? Is that part of the transition that you referenced earlier?
That's definitely part of it. And I think, like most men in North American culture, we read vulnerability as weakness, right? We are vulnerable to, having our social status damaged or to look stupid or, always, it always reminds me of the Margaret Atwood quip, men are afraid of women laughing at them. Now, the second part of that is women are afraid of men killing them, which is always a devastating concept when you sit with that. But the first part of like men are afraid of women laughing at them, like that's a big part of the sort of managing vulnerability and looking good and being right that, we're so trained to be. So I think my sort of, growth or maturation a lot is being okay with not looking good and being okay with getting it wrong and being okay with recognizing like, wow, I really fucked that up before. Like, that's just not the way I should have done it, but I didn't know better. And so there's compassion right alongside that. Right. But yeah, I mean, vulnerability and authenticity, like those are not, uniquely masculine characteristics, of course. I think men are particularly bad at them, largely because we train boys from a really young age to not do those things, right? We punish them. Boys don't cry kind of stuff. We demean them. We minimize them for having really human, healthy, emotional experiences. And so with my boy, we just have the experiences we have, and they're all good. Like, we normalize all of it. And that's something that even when he was younger, I didn't do particularly well. And I'm getting better at that bit by bit.
What do you think are uniquely masculine qualities?
I'm in sort of a weird transition with what masculinity is, and I have a lot of sort of conflicting and even diametrically opposed ideas. I kind of think of masculinity and femininity as imperfect heuristics. They're shorthands for clusters of behaviors and ways of being, and they correlate pretty strongly with kind of the primary energies or behavior patterns when you have a really binary gender model. So it's just an easy way to talk about things, an easy way to describe things. But I'm not so sure that they're specifically, I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I think of them more as kind of clusters and modes of being. So playing that game and just kind of going with it, masculinity would be strength and capacity and leadership and structure and courage and discipline and ability to do hard things in the face of terror. And so what I think is interesting, and this kind of maybe opens the door to a larger discussion, I think the way, even what I just said, like that's sort of pulling from some of the like warrior, king, hunter kind of energy, which at least in the sort of warrior ethos or that kind of mythology is a very young masculine way of being. It's not a broadly masculine way of being over the course of a lifetime. And I think I'm quite informed by Gillette and Moore's book, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and kind of the archetypes that they talk about. I think they fundamentally got a couple things really wrong. I think largely it goes back to, and I think this will probably resonate with you, their archaeological, anthropological observations are all based on written records, which are all post-civilization, right? So with archetypes as slowly evolving psychological templates that are buried in all of us, they evolve over extraordinarily long periods of time. So in the same way as, referencing my nutrition work, in the same way as we're not well evolved to eat modern processed foods or even grain-based agricultural diets because it's such a small part of our evolutionary history, the same thing is true on the archetypal timeline. So describing masculine archetypes looking only at the last 6 or 10 or 12,000 years really is a poor data set to pull from to understand what archetypes actually are in us at the deepest level. So I wholly reject King, Warrior, Magician, Lover as an accurate archetypal summary of the masculine. I won't say wholly reject, I'll soften that. I think there's parts that need to be kind of understood on a much longer timeline.
Right. So there's a mismatch. Just as you said,
an evolutionary mismatch, 100%.
Right.
100%.
So what are the deeper, like what would be the sort of paleo archetypes that you think underlie these things?
Yeah, so I think we can think about just the boyhood, right? The pre-adult masculine. They're boys; they're not yet adults. Yeah. There's then sort of the boy to man initiation that is done to them that forcibly separates them from family, mother, and feminine energy, and just sort of like the belonging there. They go through some sort of ritualized death process, and they're given a new identity and name, and they're taught things, and then they go through their own solitary walkabout vision quest experience where they test themselves against the world, and they come back largely successful, and they are welcomed as a new type of person. Now they are a man, right? Yeah. So then from that point on, I think the sequence, as I understand it, is they go into what I think of as a hunter archetype. And I think hunter is a broader range of capacities than just warrior. We understand warrior as the ability to kind of be strong, be protective, go to war. But as you and many other people have observed, organized warfare was not a primary mode of humans for most of human and even pre-human history. So warrior, that sort of archetypal energy, I think is a really narrow subset, a sort of like de-skilling of the larger hunter archetype, which is the ability to be in the world and be competent and confident and courageous and disciplined and to provide, right? Like that's the primary thing. And if needed, rise to the occasion of something that requires, physical, violent protection, whether it's a predator or whether it's actually another human that's, threatening your life. But the warfare part of that is a very narrow subset. And so the hunter is kind of that young masculine way of doing it. And for the most part, that's where the vast majority of men in the civilized world get stuck, somewhere between uninitiated boys and narrow, poorly functioning hunter warriors. And I think from there's like this whole other place you can go. You go into the, I'll say the hunter space is a mastery of the physical world, body, providing, protecting, procreating, but it's the outside world. And then there's the space where we realize that actually being strong and dominating and forceful and all of that actually can't solve all the problems. And we have to be like, oh, there's this thing inside me that I actually need to get to know, the inner world. And that's the sort of magician, shaman, philosopher, alchemist kind of space. I don't know what the perfect word is there, but they use magician. Gillette Moore use magician. Right. But that I think of as the mastery of the inner world. And that's what happens, kind of in somewhere between mid-20s and 40s for men, depending on what their experience is. And they're like, oh, I don't know anything that's inside of me because I've never looked at it and no one's ever encouraged me to be aware of it or value it. And so all of the things then of self-awareness and meditation and shadow work and all these different kind of ways of accessing that space. And then once you've kind of known and understood and mastered the outer world and the inner world, then you have a fully intact person, a fully intact man, like an actual like filled up self that you can then bring into relationship with romantic partners, children, extended family, community, and the world at large. And that's the lover energy. Right? You have this relational, sort of horizontal way of connecting with them. And that's the lover stuff. And I think about the comments you hear often in couples who have been together for, several decades. They're like, this is the best relationship, the best sex we've ever had in their 50s or 60s. And I think that's a function of slow maturation into that lover space. And then in the Gillette Moore's model, you would become sort of this benevolent king, in that kind of that good space. And I think, again, the problem I have with that is that it's hierarchical and it's civilizational. Right. Even if you're a good king, you're still sitting at the top of the heap. And I'm like, actually, no, I think about that, that beautiful final stage as an elder space. Right. And that is cooperative and collaborative, and they are keepers of wisdom, and they are intergenerational bridges. And I think the intergenerational bridges is something that's completely lost in the way the modern world operates. And there isn't the emphasis on that in the sort of king model. Like when the king dies, the king dies. But the council of elders can be the bridges from ancestors and past, and also advocates for a better future. And so, I'm 43, but I'm thinking about becoming an elder in the second half of my life. And so anything that drives me in that space is in the service of being able to give everything that I could possibly give by the end of my life, not just to this time period, but to my son's generation and many beyond that. Yeah. So that's how I see the archetypal layout.
Right. Yeah, I often think about how tragic it is that the sort of accumulated wisdom of the elders is rightly or wrongly considered to be irrelevant because the world is changing so fast.
Right.
Right.
Well, and I think also just especially, I don't know if especially, but including men, because the economic realities of the last certainly decades, if not a couple centuries, have taken up the vast majority of a man's waking hours. I think there's a lot less natural maturation for men as they get older. And so I think we have a whole generation. I mean, we talk about patriarchy or toxic masculinity. I think that's a stagnant, putrefied, arrested development of the young masculine. So we think we have 70-year-old men who are actually not elders. They're elderly. And I think that's an important distinction, right? Because they haven't gone through all of those integration maturations.
They're not Jews. They're Jewish, right? Yeah, that's fun. It's I like that distinction. And another aspect of that occurred to me while you were speaking, in the sort of distinction between hunter and warrior. They kind of look the same from outside. They're both armed, they're both
very capable
and keyed into their surroundings and facing certain kinds of danger and fulfilling a pro-social function, at least in theory, protecting the homeland or whatever it is. But a major difference between them is that the hunter is autonomous and the soldier is taught obedience. And I wonder how that ties into maturation, because doing what you're told is not a really good place to be as a grown man.
No, not at all. I mean, that's, I think, where, and I'll use kind of organized large-scale military structures, they're still quite adolescent in their strongly hierarchical mode.
Right.
And so, you don't have encouragement towards, making good decisions. The Western modern militaries are made up of young men who can absolutely be told what to do because they haven't yet learned how to totally think for themselves. And so by the time they're, 40 or 50, they're really bad at doing what they're told. And they're also not that valuable to the military, not just because their physical capacity is not what it was when they were 22. But because they're actually much harder to bully into doing what they're told in a kind of mindless way.
Right.
I think you make an important point there with the kind of the distinction between hunter and warrior. I think also, hunter as a much older mode of being, hunter exists in the archetypal sense in small tribal groups. So as an individual, you're actually very valuable as an individual. You might be one of a couple dozen, young men in that kind of hunter or, if necessary, warrior space. But you're not an unlimited resource. And so being a hero in seek of, in the pursuit of personal glory is actually a really dumb way to be and doesn't serve the tribe from a survival mechanism, survival standpoint. But when you have the explosion of population and urbanization post-agricultural revolution and all of that, all of a sudden you've got standing armies of thousands or tens of thousands of men, and you're completely dispensable.
Right.
And I think that's one of the important distinctions is that you can be told what to do because you're just a unit. Like you're just a thing. You're just a widget. You're not a human anymore. And so there's a real dehumanization that takes place in that shift from, to your point, a hunter with sovereignty over his body and his life. And that's stripped away when you become a military unit.
Yeah. Yeah. Think about a hunter. The more you can feel, the better hunter you're going to be. The more refined your senses are. And yet the military service is basically about teaching you not to feel. Right. Dehumanizing the enemy. Don't think about what you're doing. Don't think about the innocence. Don't think about the geopolitical implications of this. Just do what you're told.
Totally.
Yeah. It's a strange world. What is this? Your new book? I don't know how comfortable you are talking about it. That's always a bit of an issue for me, talking about books in progress. Right. But is there anything is this the sort of stuff that you're writing about, or is it another nutrition book?
Yeah, no, this is definitely the sort of stuff that I'm writing about. Having done 2 books on food specifically, and then the 3rd book on kind of mostly physical health, in a broad sense, I'm really bored of talking about that stuff. My undergraduate degree is in anatomy and physiology. I came from that world. Right. I'm like, okay, cool. I've been in that for literally 20 years. And now I'm like, okay, there's far more interesting things farther up Maslow's hierarchy. So let's talk about some more interesting stuff other than how to make your body healthy.
So dude, I'm tired of talking about sex. So I bet.
So yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I'm thinking a lot about and have been for the past several years and will be writing about. So it's kind of it's a weird pivot too, to say to my literary agent, hey, I know I'm known for writing about, food, but I'm actually going to write about masculine psychology and archetypes and development and attachment theory. And she's like, huh? How am I going to talk to publishers about that? And I'm like, well, that's your job. You figure that out.
Right.
But yeah.
Right. Do you feel like, I know personally you feel, as you just said, you've sort of done your time in the fields of nutrition and anatomy and physiology and so on. But do you also get the sense, as I do, that that's kind of played out a little bit? I know there's lots of new information. There's always research going. But I kind of feel like the basic scenario that, we evolved in a certain environment, eating and moving and, sort of sleeping in a certain way, not a specific way, but, we have a general sense. And that's an accurate guide to what's going to work for us. Like, I kind of feel like that's been established at this point. There's still people arguing it, but it feels like that tide has come in, right?
No, I totally agree with that. And I think, I think about food and, I think about, actually, I'll pick on biohacking actually as a thing because, I don't find it to be a particularly engaging, interesting thing to do. I think it often we get mired down in some of those minutiae in the very physical realm and occasionally in the psychological realm. But for the most part, we're fine tuning things. I'm like, yeah, but if you look at, this kind of, again, Maslow's hierarchy of interesting things we could do in our lifetime, you're spending all of your time in the most rudimentary, lowest level stuff. And I'm like, what about all this other beautiful stuff? And so that's what I'm actually interested in. So I agree with you. Like we have all of the solid principles that are effective for virtually everyone in their broad application, in the kind of in a broad sense. And yeah, you can personalize it and you should personalize it to an extent, but we have it, the good enough, like we have the good enough established.
Right.
Let's then notice that and use that as an opportunity to like move forward as opposed to like drilling down further into the space that is already good enough.
Right. Yeah. It's almost like a corollary to like the pickup artist world. It's like, why are you spending so much time learning how to pick someone up and no time at all learning how to relate with them once you have?
Right.
It's like, okay, your abs, your body fat content is down 0.5 percentage point, but you're still unhappy, man.
Right. Totally.
Like it's not about that. I almost feel like that stuff is, how to say this? It's like there are these conundrums around. To me, a part of masculinity is not honing your physical presence to the point where you're looking at yourself in mirrors half of every day. It's moving beyond that concern. It's moving beyond that issue. Totally. So that your sense of self-worth isn't about your abs or your biceps or your, whatever. But it kind of feels like a lot of the struggle with masculinity these days, there's I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like there's a feminization of masculinity and a masculinization of femininity. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I've said something similar, but more rooted in the sort of physiological realm. And when I was doing functional medicine practice and education in that space, I would often say to people, chronic stress feminizes men and masculinizes women.
Oh, interesting. So you mean that on a chemical level or just behaviorally?
Yeah, no, on a chemical level. The way our steroid hormone pathways respond to chronic stress skews the hormone profiles. I'm speaking in broad terms here, but skews the hormone profiles of biological men and biological women in opposite directions. And you see really commonly the behavior patterns follow that. You see body shapes follow that. You see the way they show up in their work environments and family environments follow that. And then you can play that out over, a societal level. And I think about, the sort of resurgence of some of the trying to like figure out what masculinity is. And, you mentioned Jordan Peterson. I think he's part of that. And I think that's in a way, an attempt to kind of hold on to that traditional way of thinking about masculinity as it's becoming a little bit feminized over the past several decades. So I agree with you on that. And I think I'm just saying there's a civilizational chronic stress underpinning to that shows up in behavior.
Right. And do you think that culture is also doing this? I mean, I know I never thought about it from a chemical perspective in terms of chronic stress, although I do think chronic stress underlies just about everything.
For sure.
All disease processes. But it also feels like young men are being told that strength and leadership and courage, these things are being devalued culturally. And young girls are being told, you need to take charge, you need to like get a job, you need to take care of yourself, and don't look for a man to do it on your own. A woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle,
Right.
like that kind of stuff. It kind of feels like what you're describing hormonally is also being encouraged culturally for some reason.
I think that's true. And, I think back to mid 20th century and some of the rise of feminism. And I think I have a bit of a dark, perhaps cynical view of what's happened from then till now. And thinking about it from a sort of capitalist and patriarchal through that lens, I think to a certain extent, the kind of the larger system there realized that like women were actually like they'd had enough. They were not going to do this thing anymore the way it had been done. And I think perversely and ironically, kind of economically swallowed up and kind of usurped some of that space that it's not just now that women can, work and get an education and be independent. It's also now that they have to. So they became economic units the way men have always become economic units. So there's sort of a tragic and perverse swallowing up that went on there. So yes, obviously it's better for women to have that option. I don't think it's better for everyone to be permanently, perpetually, exhaustingly beholden to those economic current realities.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. What do you think about the interrelation, though, between men and women? Do you think that there is an essential confusion or frustration because there's some sort of, archetypal or biological or like wherever we're going to locate it, but some kind of eternal masculine that men are not embodying, and there's an eternal feminine that, we should have the caveat, of course, we're talking about generalizations and there's, feminine energy in men and masculine energy in women, and that's all great and part of the natural order of things. But it does, I often, when I'm talking with young women, I often find there's a lot of frustration in women in their 20s and 30s that the men their age are ashamed of being men and don't know how to do it.
Right.
And so the women are like, will you fucking man up, like take control, like drive, take the car, make a decision. Why am I, I don't want to be involved in every decision. You know what I mean?
I actually have a kind of a metaphor for why that is. Cause I totally agree with you. I think about, men and women in the, sort of societal level or cultural level, maturation, sort of the rolling mean of where men are versus where women are. And I don't think too many people would disagree that women generally are on average individually and culturally more mature, more emotionally competent than the average man. And I don't know how long that's been true for, but it's certainly true now as I see it. And I think back to, and let's go back to mid 20th century. I think what happened there in a sort of metaphorical sense was an older, wiser, more mature woman, let's say a mother, looked at her adolescent son who was being a shithead and was like, hey, knock that off. I'm not going to stand for that behavior anymore. So there was this sort of sharp, well-deserved rebuke of the masculine behavior, the toxic masculinity, the patriarchy, all of that stuff. Because again, that's adolescent masculine behavior. That's uninitiated boy behavior. And I think about when I was, 14 or something, and if my mom grabbed me by the ear and was like, hey, you fucking stop that. There's kind of two options available to me as an uninitiated boy at that place. Those two kind of, general responses. I can get soft and tearful and apologetic and regressive and much more childlike, much smaller, or I can puff my chest and argue and get defensive and justify things and basically just be kind of angry and defensive and mutter under my breath about how shitty she is and stomp up the stairs and kick a hole in the wall upstairs. And I think those two modes of like shrinking back and becoming regressive, I think looked like soft, spiritual, spineless man of the 70s and to a certain extent of the today's, or the kind of driven underground, angry, defensive, I guess you could say masculinity, but like immature masculinity that I think has been kind of simmering and continues to show up as toxic masculinity. And I think what's worth noting there is that neither of those ways of responding to an appropriate confrontation or an appropriate rebuke are adult ways of being. Those are child ways of being. And so when men are, the vast majority are uninitiated, they're going to respond usually in one of those two ways. And I think men today don't recognize that the way of dealing with what women want from them is not a midpoint between two different adolescent or childlike responses. It's actually a third way, which is the adult way, which is like, oh, I need to take responsibility for what I did. I need to like acknowledge it. I need to apologize for it. I need to make amends if and when possible. And I need to make a plan to not do it again the same way. Like that's what an adult would do when confronted with something they've kind of gotten wrong. And I think that's what men in general need to do on a huge scale. But most men sort of do one of those other two more either regressive childlike ways or angry defensive ways.
And I wonder to what extent those two options are constrained by the fact that the boy is responding to the mother.
Right.
Right. If it were the father or other adult men who took the boy aside and said, hey, come here, I want to tell you something. That's not how you talk to a woman. That's not, how we behave. Then there are different options available. Right.
Well, and that's like the elder males in a tribe taking the boy aside and initiating the hell out of him, right? And like sometimes they're really like terrifying, overwhelming way, but it's quite forceful. It's like there's no bullshit. There's a really strong structural container there for like this is what's tolerated and this is what isn't. Like you better get back into line.
But also there's an honor in it. There's
100%.
Because, a boy wants nothing so much as to be respected by men. Right? Yep. So there's a conflict with the women, with the mother, because as you say, I think the energy is the young boy is very aligned with his mother in that that feminine world of safety and nurturance and all that. And then there's like sort of a natural differentiation from the mother, but in the current world, it feels like it's not merging then into the masculine. It's just going out into nothingness. Right.
Well, I think it's sort of like an incomplete differentiation, right?
Right.
Because biologically, behaviorally, boys do something different and become something different than their mothers, but they don't actually have a new societal space to go to where there is some instruction about how to do an entirely different thing, right?
Right.
Robert Bly talks so much about the absent father. I mean, that's the story of industrialized, labor-driven economic units, aka men. They're just not there. And they're just not there in part because they're occupied with, providing. They're also just not there because their fathers weren't there and their fathers weren't there and their fathers weren't there. And no one has any fucking idea how to be that presence for the younger generation. And so there's this like, men are adrift because there's no older sort of beacon or kind of guiding light of like what you could or should turn into as you get older. And there's no forceful initiation of like, hey, you have to do a dramatically different thing here. And I think some of the hyper individualism of capitalist society is reflective of the fact that we have those highly individualist, differentiating adolescents running around everywhere. Right. And we don't have them move from like dependent child to independent adolescent back into an interdependent adult. And we just don't move from from independent adolescent to interdependent adult, and everyone's atomized, everyone's isolated.
Right. And I feel like a lot of the anger against women, the whole incel movement, the mass shootings, the pickup artist world, that, we trick women, make them feel bad about themselves as a way to get them, a lot of that energy is an expression of that, of what you're saying, of that sort of arrested development phase of I'm differentiating myself from the feminine on the way to becoming masculine, but they're stuck there in that, I'm not a woman.
Right.
I'm against women. No, dude, you got to continue on until you circle back around and love women, but not from a place of fear.
Right. Well, I think even this whole concept of, large scale, sort of almost systematized tension between men and women, and the whole battle of the sexes kind of story is a function of operating from that independent, differentiating adolescent space, right? Because every human goes through that process, and when you're trying to differentiate, it's not so much that you know who you are, you're just trying to prove who you're not. You're pushing away, you're trying to escape the gravitational field of the family of origin. So you're just trying to be I'm not that. Right. I'm something else. I don't know what it is yet. It's something else.
It's anti. It's not pro. Yeah.
Right. And so then at some point, and I think about this, physics is kind of my way of being in the world. And so if you think about it, it's like a planet, like an orbiting body, you start on Earth in a dependent on the Earth kind of way. And you can, through maturation, push yourself outside of the gravitational field, to get away from the orbit of and being kind of stuck with the family of origin where you come from. And you can break free of that orbit. You can differentiate. You can become truly independent. But unless some other external force acts on you at that point, there's nothing to pull you back into a stable orbit around that. And I think that's the function of the masculine initiation, is to be that external force, to say, hey, you actually can't stay in this totally independent space. You actually have to come back into relationship to the community, the tribe, the collective. But that has to be done to you from the outside. And that virtually never happens in this society. And I'm scheming ways to do that for my boy as he gets older. Unfortunately, I've got a few years to figure out how to do that. But that's high on my priority list as a father.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. That metaphor really works, because you can see some guys that never get off the launch pad, failure to launch. They're all over the place, living in mom's basement and, and then you got the other guys who launch, but then drift off into space. And as you say, they never find that stable orbit.
Well, and I think the point, there is that, yes, they drift off into space alone, they perish alone, right? We don't exist well as individual humans, in the really broad sense. And so if we aren't pulled into a stable orbit where we interrelate with the place we came from and the community and the collective, but we are still actually our own sovereign creatures, there's a whole universe full of drifting, independent, uninitiated men. And my call here is for those of us who recognize that problem, is to find ways to tooth and claw, fight your way to find a way to become something remotely approximating an elder, so that as the generations go by, we can pass some small fragments of wisdom down, and over the course of many generations, try to get some of that initiatory process inserted back into normal culture instead of it being really aberrant.
Yeah. So sort of looking at this through the lens of your previous work in nutrition and health, you might say, okay, obviously the industrial agricultural food system is totally unhealthy for individuals, unhealthy for the planet, unhealthy for everybody. So you got to find a different way. And one of the ways could be, farmers markets. You get to know your local farmers. You try to, eat what's in season and eat what works for your microbiome and acknowledge yourself as part of the ecosystem and all this kind of stuff. Is there an equivalent to this, do you think, in terms of this masculine education and dealing with women? Is there a way to get back to the land, I guess?
Yeah.
In this sense, can we build communities in which these sorts of teachings and initiations start from the ground up, or is this about writing books and online stuff, do you think?
I don't know yet, is the short answer. I've looked for purely personal reasons, I've looked for those answers, those communities, those paradigms, and have found them to be virtually not present. I think I'm in some ways encouraged by kind of the rise of, men's groups, men's work in recent years. And I think it's appropriate in some cases and not in others, because the camaraderie of brothers, kind of that sort of dynamic, is fine in the bunch of teenage buddies kind of way, a fairly young, immature way. And it's also fine in the we are becoming adult, male, initiated, integrated hunters kind of way. Like we will stand shoulder to shoulder against something that's threatening, and we'll do work in the service of the collective. But then what's apparent to me, and this is less of a problem because there's just not a ton of men who are going into this space, but there is a space there where you kind of have to do it on your own, like sort of being this student, philosopher, alchemist in the laboratory at night by yourself, falling into the abyss, and that's solitary work. So I think that's just an important recognition too, that the men's groups and the men's work is really, really helpful in that particular developmental stage and in that archetypal energy. And in order to get to know your inner world, you have to be by yourself. And that's solitary work, not unsupported work, not completely isolated work, but it's not the band of brothers dynamic that occurs in a lot of the men's groups.
Yeah, that's interesting. And where do women fit into this? Is there a role for women in this maturation, or is it sort of, do you think it's something where the boys separate from the world of women into the world of men and then return transformed?
I don't entirely know. I think in the space between when the boy kind of gets kidnapped away from mother and village and tribe, I think there's a space where he has to be fully kind of separated energetically. And then there's also the space where he does get to come back as a man, right? And be welcomed by everyone in the village, including women. And I think that's a really beautiful and important process. And, I think to what happened, and we look at mental health outcomes for soldiers who fought in World War II and contrast that with American soldiers who fought in Vietnam. Right. And, when you come home from World War II, you have fought this axis of evil and conquered it. And there's so much gratitude, and there's so much everyone came together. And there was, there was a way paved for you through GI Bills and things like that. There was a place to come back to. Yeah. And when you came back from Vietnam, people spat in your face. There was no coming back to the tribe and being accepted and there being an expression of gratitude and recognition. It was actually explicit rejection there. And I think that with the stress of war being an incomplete, imperfect kind of initiation, coming back and being fully rejected is a profoundly wounding experience for young men. And I think that's one of the largest reasons why the mental health and addiction problems in the men who fought in Vietnam is the rates are tragic, to say the least. Yeah. So I think, I've had, friends and just women in general say what do I do? I want to support this. What do I do? And one of my flippant answers is be patient, which nobody likes. But I think there are more and more men awakening to the fact that the way the way things have been is not okay. And, the men who are super toxically masculine, which again is just sort of the immature, uninitiated, stagnant masculine, they might not admit that like things aren't okay. They're like, yeah, things are working totally fine for me. But there's a lot of us who are like, it actually isn't okay. And we recognize it not just because men are behaving badly in the world, but because it actually doesn't feel good for us as individuals. When we can actually have that experience and like, oh, I've had a profoundly impoverished emotional experience for most of my life, and we can really like recognize that, we're like, oh, it actually doesn't feel okay. There's more and more men waking up to that, and I think men are trying to find their way. My kind of thinking and writing and upcoming book eventually will be an attempt to contribute to that process on a large scale. And what that means is the older and perhaps more importantly, more mature women who are like desperate for men to kind of really stand up and behave in that adult way instead of either the defensive adolescent or the regressive child way, are going to have to give us a minute where they're just going to have to be patient. And they can encourage it. They can encourage that behavior when they see it, which of course is still fairly rare. Men will certainly change behavior when they find it to be rewarding or rewarded. And so I think really rewarding men who are doing that maturational process with and learning to respect and honor and value those behaviors ahead of the dominate, warrior, alpha kind of more traditional and civilizational ways. Like, men will change when the opportunity and the reward is there. It just hasn't been there very much, because I think I hear a lot from women who are like, well, I actually want a man to, be emotionally sensitive and to be self-aware and to be kind of doing his own work without me having to like prod him into doing it. And they also want men to be more of the stereotypically masculine role. And men are like, I can't actually do all of it all at the same time. So there's definitely...
Sorry, I was going to say, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that young women should be attracted to older men, that's the way this is going to work out. Because then the young men will see...
But probably are, right?
But then the young men will see, like, now why is she into that guy? Like that old dude. Right. It's like, because he's fucking grown up. That's why.
Right.
So
not because he's rich, right? This is the differentiation. Because the model now is young woman with older guy. It's because he has status, he has power, he has money. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a man who might be in that sort of integrated, he's gone past just the, sticking in the hunter warrior physical domain. And he's gone past perhaps even the shaman, magician, alchemist, philosopher, student space. And he's gone into the place where he now has a full self, and he's in that lover space. And that's the mature, grown up adult man that I do think that some women find profoundly attractive. There's just not a ton of those either. Thank God. We're all going there.
I'm already there, dude.
Well done.
I've been there. Listen, before we start saying things we shouldn't, thank you, Dallas. This has been great. I really enjoyed this. I hope you'll come back and we can talk more about this when your book's ready to launch.
I would love that. Thanks for having me. These are good conversations, and I hope to have more of them.
Yeah, they're needed. I appreciate it.